Welcome to Big Tent USA. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Susan Lehman, and I'm delighted to host this evening's discussion with Barbara McQuade and Kimberly Atkins Stohr. We are thrilled to see so many friends here. I can tell you our tent is growing. At Big Tent USA, we put democracy above partisanship. We are a national women-led voter coalition dedicated to protecting democracy, women's reproductive rights, and our children's future through education and civic engagement. I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. We welcome back Barbara McQuade under the tent. She is the author of Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. She is professor at the University of Michigan Law School, her alma mater, where she teaches courses in criminal law, criminal procedure, national security, and data privacy. She is also a legal expert for NBC News and MSNBC, and a co-host of the terrific podcast Sisters-in-Law. Kimberly Atkins Stohr is a senior opinion writer and columnist at the Boston Globe. She is also an MSNBC contributor and a frequent panelist on NBC's Meet the Press, and co-host of the weekly Politicon, Legal News, and podcast Sisters-in-Law. Their discussion will focus on Barbara's new book, Attack from Within. This book is an urgent, comprehensive explanation of the ways disinformation is impacting democracy and practical solutions that can be pursued to strengthen the public, media, and truth-based politics. We very much look forward to their discussion. Thank you both for being here. I'm passing it over to Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that great introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for this really important talk about this very important book, Attack from Within by Barb McQuade. Barb, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And let me say thank you very much for agreeing to moderate tonight. What a great sister-in-law you are indeed. And even excellent product placement there with the book. So thank you for that. And thank you to Susan and Big Tent for inviting me to come speak about my book. I've had a chance to speak to this group before. What an amazing group this is. What an amazing opportunity to bring together people who are interested and engaged in learning more about democracy and how to help. So I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you to Susan. Thank you to Kim.
Wonderful. Let's jump right in because we don't have a lot of time, but I have a lot of questions. And I just want to start, Barb, can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book, especially given your background, your legal background, when it comes to the issue of misinformation?
Yeah, boy, I see this as such an acute problem facing our society today. I spent the bulk of my career as a national security prosecutor, and in that work, I worked against threats to our national security. And during the time I did that work, I saw the threats evolve from Al Qaeda to then ISIS to Russia and China, and now I believe the greatest threat to our national security is disinformation, information warfare. And although some of it is coming from hostile foreign adversaries, I believe that the harshest part of this problem is really coming from within the United States, hence the name of the book, Attack from Within. And so I continue to teach in this space on national security. And in the 7 years since I started teaching law school at the University of Michigan, disinformation has been a growing part of what I've been teaching and studying and researching and reading about. So what I wanted to do is to just write a book that was accessible to ordinary people so that we could identify disinformation, understand the tactics, reveal it so that we can avoid being manipulated by it.
And you open the book by writing about being disinformed to death. And I thought that that was, as you said, a really good way to bring home exactly what you mean about what the threat of disinformation really is. Why did you start the book that way, and explain to us what that means?
Yes, I start by telling the story of a woman named Roseanne Boyland. And she was a woman who was from Georgia who went to the Capitol on January 6th because she believed these false claims that the election had been stolen and that American patriots needed to do something about it. And so she went to Washington. She was there at the Capitol on that day. She found herself in a narrow area in an entryway near the Capitol, and ultimately was crushed in the mob. She was also using some prohibited substances, and so the cause of death was in part this overdose, but medical examiners said that she would not have died if not for this crowded situation and all of the chaos. And it was her sister who said that she would not even have been there in Washington if not for all the misinformation. And I just thought that her life and her death was an apt metaphor for how those of us who want to be good patriots and learn about our country and help and do what we can be led astray by people who prey upon the rest of us to get their own way for political power, for career ambition, whatever it may be, and act in reckless disregard for individual lives and the collective lives of the United States.
Wow, that's really really gets to the heart of what we're talking about. So let's sort of start off with some basics. Can you explain to us how disinformation works and what it can look like?
Yes, disinformation can take on a lot of shapes and forms, and it's a term. It means more than just lies. Some people have asked me, like, why don't you just call it lies? Why do you use this big word, disinformation? Disinformation is really more comes from the world of counterintelligence, and it could be something with a germ of truth that's an exaggeration. It could be propaganda. It could be an outright lie. It could be something misleading, but it is typically designed to evoke an emotional response to get us to take some action. And I use that term in contrast to its unwitting twin, misinformation. Sometimes my kids refer to me as misinformation. Hilarious, but and some people use the terms interchangeably, and I suppose there's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to differentiate between the two because I think that I wanted to discuss them differently, because disinformation is this deliberate effort to deceive. Misinformation, on the other hand, is when somebody reads something, believes it to be true, and then acts on it, like Roseanne Boylan. I myself, Kim, believe it or not, was once the victim of misinformation. I read something online that I believed to be true, and I spread it. It was a story that Patrick Mahomes, the NFL star quarterback, highest paid player in the league, had made a statement that he was refusing to play another down for the Kansas City Chiefs until they changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans. And I thought, wow, taking a stand. Highest paid player in the NFL, not going to play another down until his team changes its name. Good for you, Patrick Mahomes. I had to retweet that, put that out there. And then later that day, I was talking to my husband and one of my sons and told them this and said, did you guys see that story about Patrick Mahomes? And they said, no, what story? Come on, changing their name, Native Americans, Kansas City Chiefs. They said, no, haven't heard anything about that. Are you sure that's true? Because it sounds kind of fake. And as I said it out loud, I thought to myself, it does sound kind of fake. So I went back to look it up to see the source, and I found it on my phone, on Twitter, and it looked pretty good. It was a statement from the account of ESPN, the sports channel. That's pretty legit. But as I read a little more closely, I noticed that it was not from ESPN's Sports Center account. It was instead from an account called Sprots Center. SPROTS, misspelling it. So it was a fake. I had fallen for a fake. But it's a great example, I think, of how we fall for these things. Why did that come to me? Number one, these social media platforms are scraping our personal data so that messages can be micro-targeted to us based on our interests. I am a sports enthusiast. I am someone who cares deeply about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Celebrity athletes. So this thing hit all the buttons for me. And, maybe it's something that either outrages us or something that excites us, something that we want to be true. And so we're eager to share this with the world without doing the right things that we should do to verify that this is accurate before we spread it to other people. So that in a nutshell is the difference between disinformation and misinformation.
So this leads me really nicely into my next question, which is, how is it that the spread of disinformation can be so effective, especially among people like me? We make a living out of being very skeptical, out of examining facts and trying to explain them and getting to the bottom of the truth. But even I can be misled by something that isn't entirely true. Why is it that people are so willing to believe disinformation?
Yeah, that was one of the things I was most curious about, Kim, in writing the book. And so I've got a whole chapter on why it works. And I read about, the cognitive biases that we have, and people who are good at manipulation through disinformation understand those ways that we can be manipulated. So one of the tactics that disinformers use is something called the either or fallacy. And so it is this idea that there are only two sides to every issue. There's us and there's them. And they're going to constantly keep pushing us apart by making them, whoever they may be on some issue, whether it's red versus blue, Democrats versus Republicans, whether it's issues of race or issues of immigration, stoking those divisions and making the other side look so awful and so untenable that the side of the speaker is the only one that becomes a real option. And of course, the world is far more nuanced than that. But it pushes us to take a side, and to take a side that is the one opposite of the one that is being portrayed. Robert Mueller wrote in his report a lot about manipulation on social media. And one of the things he disclosed was that there were false accounts online set up by Russian operatives with names like Blacktivist and United Muslims of America, Tennessee GOP, Heart of Texas, that looked like ordinary Americans who were active in politics. But instead, they were Russian activists who were planting seeds of division. They would say things purporting to be something that that group cared about and favored, but it would be something outrageous. And so people on the other side of that issue would see it and say, oh my gosh, look at how awful these people are. Can you believe it? And so it was just an effort to stoke division. So that's one of the things, that divide and conquer mentality. But there's some other cognitive forces that we have that make us easy prey. One is fear. We are susceptible to conspiracy theories in part because of fear. Fear is a powerful motivator. Fear is probably what got me through law school, Kim, truth be told. And so, fear is something that causes us to act in certain ways, but it also is what causes us to buy into conspiracy theories. And we're wired to look for patterns in things and to believe that things don't just happen randomly or coincidentally. And in some ways, it's a helpful coping mechanism. When we see dark clouds gathering in the sky, we have learned from experience that probably means a storm is coming. And so we better take precautions to protect ourselves against a storm. It's the same kind of thing that actually contributes to implicit bias. We have life experiences, so we don't have to relearn every scenario every time we enter a situation. We know that if the stove is on, it's probably hot and we shouldn't touch it. But it's the same thing that causes us to make all kinds of snap judgments and buy into stereotypes and other kinds of things because we're wired for conspiracies. And so people prey upon those things and say that, the COVID coronavirus must have been deliberately created in a lab, and COVID vaccines are all designed to, harm us, or it's part of government manipulation. We're kind of wired to believe those things. So it doesn't take much to push us over the edge. And another one I'll mention, and I'll stop with this one, is confirmation bias. And this is something all of us have. We tend to recognize and remember facts that fulfill our narrative and our belief system, and we tend to ignore the ones that don't satisfy our narrative or our belief system. For example, I have a sister who's always late. She's late for everything. And I notice when she's late, I complain when she's late. If it's a family gathering, if we're going to dinner, whatever it is, she's always late. And she said to me once, how come you never notice when I'm on time? And I said, because you're always late. She said, no, I'm on time a lot, but you only notice it. And you only say anything when I'm late. And I thought to myself, I think she's right. And that's because that's my confirmation bias, right? I only notice when it fits that narrative. It's something I also learned about in law enforcement, about how dangerous it is to have a theory and then look for the evidence. That's what leads to false convictions, because people will find the things that confirm their theory and ignore the facts that are inconsistent with that theory. It's why it's so important for investigators and prosecutors to follow the evidence where it leads, as opposed to reaching some conclusion and then reverse engineering it. But all of those things are things that can be used against us to manipulate us into believing things that are true when they're not.
So I want to note, I know that members of our audience are submitting questions. We know that, we see them, and I'm going to save some time at the end to get through as many of those questions as we can after Barb and I continue and finish up our conversation one-on-one. But Barb, can you put together, so you've laid out disinformation, the kinds it is and ways that it works. But your book is about it attacking our institutions in our nation. You pose it as a homeland security threat. So can you put those threads together about how disinformation can threaten us, can really attack us from within?
Yes, so there are a number of ways. I mean, certainly it is harmful to democracy when we have people attacking election results and undermining confidence in election systems with false claims that elections are rigged. That causes our democracy to be less stable and for the public to have less confidence in our leaders. We have seen disinformation attacking elections in three ways. One is by influencing which candidate we should vote for. I mentioned earlier the Mueller report reference to a number of false accounts. One in particular was called Blacktivist, that posed as a Black political activist who said all kinds of interesting things for many, many months and attracted lots of followers. And then just before the election, said things like, Hillary Clinton has never done anything for our community. We should send her a message that we will not be taken for granted by staying home from the polls on election day. Now, we'll never know how many people heeded that advice and actually stayed home. But in a close election, in a swing state decided by a narrow margin, that could have made a real difference. So influencing particular candidates is one way that disinformation attacks democracy. Another one is just dampening voter turnout. So by telling people false things, for example, in New Hampshire during the primaries this year, you may have read about the robocalls pretending to be the voice of Joe Biden, urging voters to stay home from the primary election and save your vote for the general. I mean, that doesn't even make any sense, but that was the robocall that people got in New Hampshire. Imagine if this fall people get messages saying things like, we're calling from your polling place where the power is out. Come back on Wednesday and cast your ballot then, or come back next week. And that could really have a dampening effect on voter turnout. And then finally, for democracy, there is this idea of just undermining confidence in democracy altogether by suggesting that elections are rigged and we can't be confident in the outcome. But when all of these Republicans and Trump supporters refuse to say they're going to accept the outcome of the election, they are really harming democracy in that way and laying the groundwork and planting the seeds to later challenge the results of the election. Make no mistake about that. And it is incredibly harmful to our national security. Since World War II, it has been the national foreign policy of the United States to lift up democracies around the world. And the reason we do that is we believe that when other countries have democratic forms of government, we have fewer wars, there are fewer famines, fewer refugee crises, and we have more and better trade partners. It protects our national security when other countries are democracies. And what are we seeing in recent years? We are seeing a backsliding of democracy in a number of countries: Ukraine, Turkey, some of the former Soviet republics, Venezuela, other places in Europe. And why are we seeing this? Well, in part because of what happened in the United States in the 2020 election. After the attack on the Capitol, a Russian official said, the United States is no longer the model for the world for democracy. American democracy is limping on both feet. President Xi in China said, you see, based on this example of the United States, democracy doesn't work. People can't agree on how to govern themselves. It is better to have a strong leader who can lead, because after all, the point isn't democracy. The point is prosperity, and a strong leader can deliver that. Of course, never mind the fact that in China, we have lots of journalists and protesters and other dissidents who are locked up and jailed because they disagree with democracy. So those are some of the ways that disinformation is harming our democracy, let alone what I think is happening to public safety and the rule of law through vigilante violence.
Right. That's such an important topic too. I want to sort of drill down on how we can identify and deal with disinformation at a time where we see it coming from our leaders, right? There is not a unified message always about what it is, and that can be very confusing for the public, right? Just today, there was a House hearing where our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, testified before a House committee, really defending the Justice Department against claims that it is weaponized, that it is weaponized against Republicans, it is weaponized against former President Donald Trump. And Merrick Garland's role in that was to combat those claims, but he often was seen as debunking. His job was to debunk falsehoods that, for example, the DOJ had something to do with the state prosecutions against Donald Trump in New York and Georgia. So when the public sees an elected, multiple elected officials talking to an administration official and them giving completely different narratives, what does that do to both the idea of democracy and rule of law, Barb?
Yeah, I think one of the things it does is it causes good people to tune out, to say, I'm exhausted, I'm cynical, they're all a bunch of crooks. I don't know who's lying, but I know somebody's lying, and I'm too exhausted to figure it out. And that really is part of the strategy, to just exhaust us with competing claims. One of the things we see in Putin's Russia is this idea of Vladimir Putin himself puts out statements that are inconsistent. And the idea is for people to become so numb and cynical that they tune out of politics altogether, and they say, I'm just going to worry about my job and my family, and I'm not going to worry about politics because it's all spin, it's all PR, it's all a bunch of lies anyway. Truth is for suckers. Everybody's in on the joke, and I'm a chump if I care about truth or integrity. And I think if we reach that point, all is lost. And so I appreciate Merrick Garland for stepping up to try to defend the Department of Justice, because if we don't have the rule of law, then we have anarchy and chaos. Certainly in this country, we can disagree about all kinds of things, and we always have, but we resolve our disputes peacefully at the ballot box and in courts of law. Because what's the alternative? It is just simply a survival of the fittest, the strongest, the most powerful. People who are the most physically powerful, politically powerful, or financially powerful are the people who control the world in a world without the law. The law is designed to equalize power among all of the people. And so I think that's something worth fighting for. But I see this very cynical power grab currently by far right members of Congress who are accusing the Justice Department of weaponizing the department. They've accused Fani Willis of weaponizing her office. They've accused Alvin Bragg of weaponizing his office. They accused Liz Cheney of weaponizing Congress when she led the investigation into the January 6th attack. All of those things are efforts to uncover facts and hold people accountable. And that is how our criminal justice system works. That's what Merrick Garland does. And when you hear about these escalations of threats and swatting incidents, it is very concerning to me that people are instead trying to take the law into their own hands. And so I urge everybody here that it does matter, that you can't grow cynical, that you can't get exhausted, tempting as it may be. And I certainly understand that. And if you need to take a break from time to time, you should get out in nature and spend time away from the news, but rest a little bit and then get back into the work, because it matters for today and tomorrow in our democracy.
Indeed, it does. And before we get to our audience questions, I want to ask you a couple more. They're really related questions, but on different levels. First, on a macro level, how can disinformation be combated? I mean, by our institutions, by the media, by the players in our society. And the next question will be, on a micro level, how can we combat the disinformation that we see in conversations that we have every day, sometimes between strangers, sometimes between loved ones? So let's start at the macro. What are some of the solutions and how this can be combated?
Yeah, so at the macro level, I think there are a number of things that we can do as a society. One of the things is just some common sense regulation of social media. Social media is in its infancy. And, actually, I suppose a more apt metaphor is that it's in its adolescence. It's like the surly teenager that's rolling its eyes at you and talking back and getting a little sassy. And we haven't done anything about it. In 1996, we passed a law called the Communications Decency Act, and part of that gave legal immunity to internet service providers, which include social media platforms, so that we could foster creativity and innovation and investment. That's what we wanted to do. And that was great. And we did. But now it's grown to something unrecognizable. And so maybe we need to change the way we deal with it. It's sort of like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. It's adorable to begin with, but at some point it grows into a man-eating predator, and you need to change the way you're caring for it. And I think that's true when it comes to social media. There's a lot of pushback on that from big tech itself, because nobody wants to be regulated. The business of business is business. And so if you're Facebook, you say, we can take care of it ourselves. We don't need anybody to tell us how to deal with this. But I think there's certainly a lot that we can do. One of the things we can do, I think, is based on a disclosure made by a whistleblower, a former data scientist for Facebook named Frances Haugens. And what she said when she testified before Congress is, it's not the content, it's the algorithms. And the algorithms, is just this computer code that the social media platforms use to rank the order of things that show up in your feed. And what she disclosed is that Facebook was deliberately ranking highest content that was designed to outrage us. Because the more outraged we were when we got online, the longer we stayed on. We were more engaged. We would send things. Do you believe this? Did you see what happened? I got to respond to this. You're wrong. RONG, wrong. Let me tell you why. And so because the longer people are on the platform, the more ads they can sell and the more they can sell ads for. So she said, for Facebook, anger and outrage equals money. So why can't we regulate those algorithms, require that they be disclosed, require that the ranking system be based on something other than outrage? I think that's something that we can do. I think that we can regulate the way social media companies scrape that personal data so that they know who we are and can micro-target us with ads. They collect our data, they sell it to data brokers, who in turn sell it to commercial enterprises and political consultants. And based on that information, they are building profiles on all of us, and they know exactly how to push our buttons, what to sell us. I mean, is it any coincidence, Kim, that I constantly get offers for advertisements to buy Detroit Tigers baseball caps? No. How do they know? They know me so well. They know me better than I know myself, because they see what I like and what I share, and they're collecting all this data about me. And so are there ways that we can protect our own data so that we are not micro-targeted in that way? And then finally, with regard to social media, I think that we could eliminate the bots that are online. These are these fake accounts that are allowed to fester online. They might have names like Patriot Girl or Eagle Man, and they're just programmed to fight with you. If you say something about, the need for common sense gun legislation, they'll start calling you a communist, left-wing socialist, something, all kinds of names in the book. And if you respond, you're really only arguing with software, and you'll never win, because they're programmed to just keep coming back and back and back and saying these things again and again and again. They also amplify disinformation by liking and sharing the false claims that get posted there by their masters. So I think we could rid social media of all of those bots. I think that would be helpful. Some other suggestions as well about transparency in campaign finance. But one other I want to mention at the macro level comes more from the demand side. I've been talking about the supply side of disinformation, and that is the need for media literacy. I think we need to introduce into our schools media literacy. I think we need to use lifelong learning opportunities through colleges, civic organizations, faith groups, and others, the ability to teach people good media literacy so that they can be a skeptic and look for a second source, read beyond the headline, look for good data samples, understand the difference between correlation and causation. There are a lot of things that are the hallmarks of good media literacy. So I'll stop there on macro things so that we can move on to your next question and your last question.
Yes. I would add to what you're saying. I think it's also incumbent on media organizations to move past the desire to get clicks and to maximize their reach and focus more on making sure that everything from the headline to what's inside is accurate. But moving on to the micro level, we were just discussing a little bit before this event started about how even I came across an Uber driver of mine who was asking me questions about the bridge collapse in Baltimore. and saying all kinds of conspiracy theories that he was really concerned about, and asking me about it once he realized I was a journalist, and I dispelled a lot of that. And he was grateful for it. He said, thank you for telling me this truth. He wasn't somebody who was trying to mislead people. He had been misled, was asking me about it, and I honestly didn't know what was truthful. So in circumstances like that, when we as individuals come across people who are clearly informed because they've been disinformed
Yeah.
and are spreading that, what do you do? Can you hear me, Barb?
You know, you froze there for just 1 second. I got all
Okay.
the way through when we find
What
people
do
who
we
are
do
disinformed.
when we're confronted with that on a micro level?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's such a great question. You know, I think you got to pick your battles. And so understand the situation as you did by asking questions. Is this a person who is earnest, you know, and in good faith, trying to understand what the facts are? Or are they instead somebody who is putting tribe over truth and knows better and doesn't care and is just going to repeat the mantra regardless of what facts are true? So I think you need to assess that situation first. And it sounds like you did, and that you assessed that your Uber driver was someone who was genuinely interested in knowing the truth. I think that it's tricky because I think it's quite possible that we can alienate people if we try to browbeat them or lecture them with what, you know, I'm right and you're wrong. But I think that if we come to people through love and grace and respect, we can help share information. You know, I'll give you an example of my mother. She is someone who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. It was really shocking to me. And when I asked her why, she said, well, you know, I saw him on The Apprentice and he was a very successful businessman. So I thought he could help make our country very successful like that as well. She has since learned that was not true. But I remember having conversations with her at the time, trying to dispel her of her views of him, and I was not successful. But I think she's come around, and part of it is we've, you know, talked about some of the things that he has done or hasn't done, and some of you know, the anger that he represents. And so one of the lessons I guess I would give is don't always expect to convince somebody that they're wrong about certain facts the first time you meet with them. You might just be planting seeds. You know, you and I probably learned this as negotiators, as lawyers. You might not, you know, get a resolution the first time you sit down and talk with somebody, but
Right.
maybe you give them a few, you know, a little bit of food for thought. You show respect. You show that you care more about preserving the relationship than you do about winning any argument. You show that you yourself might be willing to change your mind. I mean, I think we should ask all of us ourselves, when was the last time we reconsidered our views on hot button issues like, you know, guns and abortion and affirmative action and other kinds of things? Should we be considering other arguments? And if we don't, how can we expect other people to consider arguments as well and their views on other arguments? So I think we've got to try, but I think we need to be patient and respectful when we're working with our loved ones. But I also think, Kim, that one of the things that's really important is that we just be out there. I think so much of this problem festered during COVID. It has continued as people work more from home and less in public. We have seen this phenomenon first described by Robert Putnam in a book called Bowling Alone that was published in 2000, about how people no longer joined civic groups or got out in the world, joining labor unions. And, you know, he blamed it all on television, that everybody was staying home to watch TV. It was so much easier than going out and joining things. And now, of course, we have the internet, which makes it very easy for us to stay in our homes and do things
Yeah.
in meetings like this one. But the importance of getting out there in the world and doing things with real people, whether it's a faith community, whether it's coaching, whether it's civic organizations, teaching, anywhere where you meet real people. Because I think when you meet real people, it's much harder to believe all of these lies about other groups, because it's a good reminder that we all have more in common than we have differences. And we all really want the same things, right? We want health and prosperity and safety and a better life for our children. And so I think when we're out in the real world talking with real people, we see those things.
Wonderful. So we have a lot of questions to get through. So I'm going to get start on them now. One is, can you talk about how legacy media is struggling and how this impacts disinformation? What's the pressure from above at these traditional media outlets?
Well, I would love to get your thought on that too, Kim, since you work for the Boston Globe. Um, I don't know, but I do think that media outlets have changed a lot, even though much of their work might still be, print or digital editions of their paper or their broadcast. They all have significant social media presences, and I think they all take a lot of cues from social media. And I think there's this need, perceived or otherwise, to be instantaneous. I remember when I was at the U.S. Attorney's office not all that long ago, in the early days, we would get requests from reporters for a comment on a story. And, we'd say, what's your deadline? They'd say, 5 p.m., 7 p.m., 11 p.m., whatever it was. And we would spend the time researching the answer. We might need to talk to victims of crime. We might need to talk to the Department of Justice. We might not need to talk to investigative agencies who were involved, like the FBI. And we would do all that. And sometimes we'd decline comment. Sometimes we'd have a comment. Now, toward the end of my time there, they would say, I need a comment immediately. Like, well, I'll get you one. And so the first version of the story was the U.S. Attorney's office, did not immediately respond with comment. So as a result, I think the story is less accurate because they don't have all the information. They may change it later, but it seems like when I was, in that role, they cared more about accuracy than speed. And now it seems to be reversed, that they care more about speed than accuracy. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, one thing that we do know from data is that when there are multiple versions of a story, if it gets updated later with more information, it's the first story that gets more hits and gets read more than the second story that has a lot more context and build up to that. I also think it's something that's become the bane of my existence, speaking for myself, which is something called SEO, which is search engine optimization, which is a desire to change the headline, the top part of your story, things, so that search engines will pick them up and people are more likely to read them. Now, I appreciate that we want stories to be read, but there are times that I fight back as a journalist to say, well, I really also want this to be accurate. And the way that we've changed that headline doesn't really encapsulate exactly what is written, even if it's spread. If it's not spreading completely accurately, that's a problem. So I think that is something that the media is still struggling with. And I still think that there is muscle memory of covering past campaigns where we give equal time without giving full context. And I think that is something that media is still struggling with, frankly, which is
both
a
sides of
problem.
the story.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Can I interject an example of
Yes.
what we're talking about with headlines? I've read one today and I clicked on it. And once I read the story, I was very angry because the story did not match the headline whatsoever. The headline was Caitlin Clark Media Meltdown. And so my thought was, oh my gosh, Caitlin Clark had a meltdown in the media. I got to read this. What did she do? What happened? And I read it. It wasn't Caitlin Clark at all. It was some member of the media referred to her with a slur. It was a media member
person
that melted down. Yeah. So
not the whole media melting down. It was one person. Yes.
Yeah, it was the exact opposite of what the headline suggested. So
yes,
I thought that was something sort of
a great example
of exactly what you're talking about.
So the next question is, what can we do to try to reach someone who's been brainwashed by disinformation? You touched on that a little bit, but maybe we can just drill just a little bit more into it, because I know there is data that shows, I mean, listen, I'm a newspaper columnist. My job is to try to convince people of things, but the data show that they believe things from people believe things when they're told by someone they trust.
Yeah.
So maybe part of it is knowing who you can't reach and who you can, right?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think one of the things that is exacerbating that problem in today's world is the information overload we all feel. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I get so much information from so many different news sources. Sometimes it's hard to keep up. And sometimes you look for, a credible outlet or a credible analyst to help you process that. I know that's what we hope to do in our commentary on MSNBC. But it is why I think it's important to think about, when you're talking to your loved ones, people trust you and maybe you can get through to them. I know that right now, for example, in Michigan, our Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, wonderful public official, is concerned about disinformation that will be coming our way for the 2024 election. And so right now, she is working on recruiting ambassadors of people that will be trusted in various communities to share with them accurate voting information. here's how you go to the polls, here's when you do it, here's what you need to do to register. So she is finding pastors in various communities who can talk to people about, I don't care who you vote for, but this is how you vote, and this is the information you need so that they don't fall prey to some of these disinformation scams. Or she wants to engage professional athletes who are respected in a bipartisan way. In Detroit, we're all gaga over the Detroit Lions this year for making it to the NFC Championship game. So whether you are, regardless of your politics, everybody agrees on the Lions. And so could they be utilized as ambassadors? So I think this idea of a trusted messenger can be really important. And so there may be people in your life who will believe everything they see on Fox News or elsewhere. But if you actually take the time to talk to them because they believe you, just, like my mother is a good example,
Yeah.
You can break through.
Yeah. So the next question is, how can we combat the bias and misinformation that is being spread by several branches of the federal government? I mean, I think an example, Barb, that we've seen is you have somebody who is very well respected by some people, and someone like Mitt Romney, former governor of Massachusetts, now senator from Utah, Harvard Law grad. But he suggested that Alvin Bragg's prosecution of Donald Trump, which ended with 12 jurors finding him guilty on 34 counts, was a poor political calculation by the prosecutor. That, to me, is somebody who understands very well how the government works and should know better, but he's still spreading something that is disinformation that people will take. What do you do when that happens?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I had a piece I wrote in Time Magazine today that is entitled something like, debunking 12 myths. I can put a link to it in the chat. There it is. Because there are a lot of myths, I call them myths, which is sort of a nice way of saying lies, that are going on about the prosecution of Donald Trump. I mean, all kinds of things like he didn't even know what he was charged with. They didn't even tell him, or this was just a bookkeeping error. This is not a crime. And so, I tried to explain in there what these crimes are, why they are routinely charged in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. They've charged this crime 10,000 times since 2015. The idea that Donald Trump was only charged because he's running for president is really absurd. They point to, well, they waited to go to trial till just before the election. Well, you know why there was this big delay? A big part of it was because Donald Trump himself challenged the prosecutor's subpoenaing of his financial records. Remember, it was when Cyrus Vance was still the prosecutor there several years ago, and he delayed that investigation by several years by taking it up to the Supreme Court twice. So, this idea that, it's all been timed to have maximum effect on the election, well, blame Donald Trump for that. So I think that, a really good playbook for how to address disinformation is not to repeat the disinformation, but to state what is true. These are the facts. This is a crime. This occurred. He's been held accountable, just like anybody else would be who committed this crime in New York. So I do think, I know it's exhausting, but I do think that when we think the moment is right, I suppose I said it earlier, we have to pick our battles. But when we have an opportunity and when we have access to accurate facts, I do think it is our responsibility to try to set the record straight.
All right. This is a very good question. Can you talk about how disinformation is used to raise money?
Oh, yeah. Great one. So it is, again, this whole idea of us versus them, the either or fallacy. There's only two sides to any issue, and the other side is the enemy. Donald Trump plays this to perfection. So anytime something bad happens to him, he tries to turn the tables and say, look at how awful these people are for doing this bad thing to me unfairly. So he gets charged with crimes in Georgia, arrested, and has his mugshot taken. And then he's selling it on t-shirts and coffee mugs because he is trying to say, I'm the victim here. I mean, what other person charged with a crime can do that and portray themselves as victims? But this idea of victimhood, he also uses this phrase, they're not really after me, they're really after you, and I'm just standing in their way. What? Who is it that they are after? But that is this idea, and he uses it for fundraising. Chip in, vote for me. And people, it's an odd thing, but it seems to work because he gets people angry and stoked up. And it's not just Donald Trump, it's certainly all of the others who fundraise off of grievance. Marjorie Taylor Greene does it, Warren Boebert, and other members of Congress. You know, this idea that there are elites who look down upon you, and this is our revenge. That is a real theme in all of this. And I think that is something that it's been successful. This polarized politics is something that gets people to the polls and gets people to raise funds.
Yeah. So another question is, please address how media outlets well, we talked a little bit about how media outlets and social media spread disinformation, but let me put a little twist on that. What advice do you give to members in the media who have to confront when they're talking to people who they're interviewing who might be spreading information, for example, or people who may be leading, moderating debates that come up with
Mm,
information might be coming fast and furious from one of the candidates?
mhm.
What tools can they use in that in order to guard or at least flag what is true and what is not? I think that's something that members of the media are struggling with right now.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and I think it's really challenging. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, speaks in what Jim Comey referred to as word salad, right? He just says a whole bunch of things. They aren't even sentences, let alone paragraphs, when he's spewing things. And I think it can be very difficult for people to fact check in real time because he'll just say whatever comes to his mind if it supports his cause. He makes all kinds of false claims about the economy being the greatest economy in the history of the world during his administration, and how awful things are now and in decline, when in fact, the Dow Jones is at an all-time high, unemployment is at an all-time low. And so I think, to the extent, if it's a live interview, there can be real fact checking. It probably requires more than just the journalist conducting the interview. It probably requires a team of fact checkers, so that while the person is asking the questions, I mean, just as we have today, Kim, you're asking the questions, and we've got other people kind of helping to collect the questions and putting them
Yeah.
in the chat. It takes a village to pull this off. And so
Yes,
I
it
think that
does.
when you're Caitlin Collins famously did a I'm sorry, is it Caitlin Collins at CNN? Is that her name? Caitlin,
Yes.
I'm confusing her with the Iowa basketball player. Caitlin
I,
Collins.
it is Caitlin Collins, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Caitlin Clark is the basketball player. Caitlin
Yes.
Collins is the CNN commentator. She did her best to keep up, but he was just
Yeah.
spewing so much false information that she just couldn't keep up because she didn't have the data at her fingertips for all of this crazy stuff that he's making up. So I think you
Right.
need a staff of people. But I also think that when you are doing things, it is important to correct the record. I know I got media training when I was at the Department of Justice, and they warned us that from time to time, you might find yourself in a media situation where someone asks you a question based on a false premise.
Yeah.
When you falsely charged all those people with crimes, did you ever consider, and then they get to the meat of the question. You're like, whoa, whoa, whoa,
Right.
whoa, stop, time out.
Right.
The premise of that is not accurate. I have to correct the record here. So I do think that journalists need to, to help in that regard. And I think journalists can be a really important part of the solution. We have a lot of very credible brands in journalism, and I think that they have a responsibility to help us process information in an accurate way. And certainly many newspapers have their own political slant on their opinion pages, but
Sure.
I think that they are providing accurate facts on their news pages. And I think the best way for us to make sure we're getting a full story is by reading more than one outlet. So, we can
Yes.
read the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and look at the BBC, and try to get a variety of news sources so that we are not captive to the viewpoints of one set of reporters and opinion page writers.
Yeah, and that gets to your point about media literacy, which is so, so important. Here's a question. Can you address how the Democrats responded to Russian interference in 2016? And I will broaden that a little bit to also talk about how the government responded. I feel like everyone forgot about the Mueller report,
Yeah.
and the harbingers that had about this very topic.
Yes, I think the government's response in 2016 was very poor. They made an announcement on October 7th, I think it was, of 2016, that they had assessed that Russia had interfered with the election. And you may remember that President Obama later sanctioned and removed from the country certain Russian diplomats. In fact, it was about those sanctions, that Michael Flynn was speaking with the Russian ambassador, remember, and all that stuff, and then denied it. They had it on tape. But it was really, I think, kind of below the radar, because it happened on the same day that the Access Hollywood tape came out. And so that got all the fanfare. And then on the same day, WikiLeaks posted all of the stolen emails from the Democratic National Committee with all of the palace intrigue that occurred there. And so I think it was a second round of weaponizing information by Russia to steal the headlines from that day after all of those things had happened. But I think that both the Obama administration and the Biden administration have been a little bit timid in this space of disinformation. You know, the Biden administration had a good start. They set up this government office of disinformation as part of the Department of Homeland Security. They had an expert named Nina Jankowicz who ran it. And after 11 days of complaints by Republicans that it was somehow a censorship bureau, they closed up shop. And Nina Jankowicz was the subject of all kinds of threats and hate mail and other kinds of things. And then there, of course, was this lawsuit in the Net Choice case that is now pending before the Supreme Court that said that the government was wrong to engage in what's called jawboning with social media companies and encourage them to take down false claims, mostly about COVID and cures that are dangerous to public safety. But when they were criticized, they kind of backed down and got kind of timid. I mean, Christopher Wray from the FBI has even said, you know, in light of this pending case, the FBI has been kind of quiet in terms of reaching out to the private sector to warn them of things, lest they be accused of, you know, lifting up one message and suppressing another message, which I think is really just shirking their duty. I think they have a responsibility to do those things. But there was the Mueller report. He indicted the Internet Research Agency and a number of other people. That report is incredibly eye-opening. I urge you to read it. The Senate did another report that covered a lot of the same themes. And so it's out there, but I think our government could do a better job of building resilience and sending a warning shot about these things. And I think for fear of being criticized of censorship, they have kind of fought this battle with one arm tied behind their back.
Wow. So yeah, I almost forgot about that Senate report, which was bipartisan. That seems like that seems so quaint now and like a far gone
Right.
Idea. So I'm going to put two questions together because they get sort of at the same thing. What's the role of Fox News in peddling disinformation? And also, are you worried about Sinclair buying the Baltimore Sun? We were talking about, you know, when something that sale actually happened right before that Baltimore bridge collapse. And I know some people in the journalism circle were wondering at a time Baltimoreans need really clear, accurate information, that there was a fear that they couldn't get it. What do you think about media organizations and their role in all of this?
Yes. So, you know, Fox News, of course, I thought would have learned its lesson when it paid a more than $700 million settlement to Dominion Voting Systems for airing false claims about voting machines that flipped votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden based on zero facts whatsoever. And the documents that were revealed in that litigation, where Fox hosts and executives admitted that they knew all along that those claims were false and that they only did it to regain the viewers that they had lost when they accurately called the election for Joe Biden. Shocking thing. And yet, you know, I was a little bit hopeful. And like a week later, they fired Tucker Carlson, you know, who was one of the great purveyors of these false claims. I thought, all right, maybe Fox has learned its way. And then like a week later, when there was some sort of filing of one of these indictments against Donald Trump, there was a shot of Joe Biden on screen, and the graphic down below said words to the effect of "wannabe dictator charges political rival." Like, okay, so you know they're back to what they were doing. So I think Fox knows that it's good for business to churn hate and outrage and fear and false claims about Democrats as, you know, global elites who want to replace you, take your guns, replace religion and white people with people of color, groom your children through the LGBTQ community for pedophilia, you know, all kinds of awful claims, because it gets people, as we said, fearful and these conspiracy theories and gets them watching and they buy into it. So I think it's an incredibly dangerous thing. And I think defamation claims might be our best hope for scaring them straight eventually, but we're not there yet. I am worried about Sinclair. You know, we've seen in this country consolidation of business in all realms. I mean, banking, hospitals, and media are all consolidating because you know, business wants to make more money and squeeze every penny out of them, and that's the way they do it. And it is really gutting local media. But I worry that when we have one company owning all of these outlets like Sinclair, they can control the messaging that everybody hears without the diversity of voices that I think would exist in a healthy democracy.
All right, we only have one more question, time for one more question, and that question is, what can the big tent community do to counter disinformation?
Such a good question. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do. One is we can, when we see false claims, we can rebut them and demand truth. I think that we need to ask ourselves, our friends, and our allies to make sure that we are putting truth over tribe. Sometimes that means conceding an argument when you don't have the better facts, even if it might go against your side. It can't be about winning and losing. It has to be about facts and about truth. I think the most important thing we can do is to get people out and vote. So help people have a plan to vote, because there will be disinformation trying to confuse people and dampen voter turnout. So make sure you have your own plan and a plan you can communicate to others so that you can help other people have accurate information to vote. And before I lose the floor, I'm going to put one more thing in the chat, and that is my email address. And I'm going to invite anybody who has either bought my book or wants to buy my book to send me an email, and I will send you a personalized book plate that you can paste into the cover. I'd be happy to, if you just tell me who you want me to make it out to, what you want me to say, and where I should mail it, I will mail one to you. You just have to promise to buy the book. Thanks so much, Kim, and thanks so much, Susan. I see she's back.
Wow. Well, thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. You reinforced the destructive effects on democratic norms when disinformation is allowed to reign, but you also provided us some ways to combat it. And Barbara, you've said with a slight paraphrase that MAGA is asking people to prioritize tribe over truth, that their goal isn't to convince followers that a lie is true, but to get them to repeat the lie despite knowing it's false. You advocate choose truth over tribe. And as Big Tent was founded as a country over party organization, we agree with you. Thank you both for your advocacy on behalf of our democracy, and to our amazing, dedicated Big Tent community, thank you again for showing up. We are in this fight for the heart and soul of our country together. Thank you for joining us under the tent, and good night.